We're all becoming someone along the way. We're all in a process of formation that eventually causes us to become someone. When my wife and I were dating and looking at getting married, my father-in-law had invited me over for a conversation, and he asked me this very specific question, and it stuck with me. And he just asked me, Tim, who is the man, who is the spouse, who is the husband, who is the friend that you want to become? And that question has been something that has guided and directed me to think about not just who I've been, what I've done, who I am today, but who do I want to become? And that's what this series has been all about, becoming and looking at who we're becoming. And the hope is we're becoming more like Jesus along the way. The poet Mary Oliver wrote this, that attention is the beginning of devotion, that what we choose to give our attention is where worship is born. William James, who is a 19th century philosopher, the father of American psychology, he wrote this. He said, we must reflect that when we reach the end of our days, our life experience will equal what we have paid attention to, whether by choice or by default. That what we give our attention to shapes our devotion, and ultimately what we are devoted to is what we worship. This plays into our time spent, the accumulation of wealth, our resources, our personal giftings and strengths. And we could all probably agree that generous people make the world a better place, and greedy people just make it worse. And because of our human nature, we are created in the image of God, which means everything good in this world and in us was created by the very author of goodness. So our life finds its purpose, finds its fulfillment as we join in that creation of good with God, that we cannot consume our way to purposeful contentment in life. There's no amount of good things that we could consume our way to a place of peace, to a place of purpose and fulfillment in life. But that as we begin to realize that who we're becoming and what we're creating from that is ultimately where we find the most purpose in. In Acts 20:35, Jesus is quoted as saying, "It is more blessed to give than it is to receive." And ultimately, that's what generosity, the topic for this week of the Becoming series, is really all about. How can we lean into a life that is creating good in the world? And that's what generosity leads us in becoming. The first point we looked at was generosity begins with receiving, that we must consider what we've been given by God. The famous African early church saint, St. Augustine, famously said in his book Confessions, "Thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee." And as we learn to receive the grace of God through the good news story of Jesus, we begin to find our life unfolding into a place of generosity because we are able to receive the generosity of God, so that our life can become more generous. So that's the first step. Generosity begins with receiving. The second thing we looked at, that generosity continues through responsibility. How might this good news story of Jesus, how might that come to bear upon our everyday life, our everyday resources in a very practical way? What does it mean for us and how we spend our money, how we spend our time, how we spend our strengths and our giftings in this world? In our work, in our relationships. What does that look like? And this ability to respond, some of us may have heard this described as stewardship. That our ability to respond to God's goodness in a worshipful expression of generosity. And the third thing we looked at was generosity grows in us through faith-filled returning. How can we use what we have to worship God? How to actually live out these teachings of Jesus that we see in Matthew 6:33 through 34 in the Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most famous, well-known sermons. And he talks about how, we're not to strive to achieve all these worldly things, but in the end he says, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. And he goes on, he says, therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And how do we put God first? How do we seek God first? What are some ways, some practical ways we can do that? We looked at these first 5 habits of generous worship to God. And to consider these in light of Jesus' teachings and his way of life, not as like a New Testament law or something we need to achieve in order to find God's kindness and favor. That's not it at all, but it's living in light of the grace of God. How do we express generosity and seeking God first? We looked at 5 examples. Giving God the first of our week. That part of when we gather on Sundays is an expression of giving God our time, setting up a priority, deciding that this is something we're going to value, to gather together with brothers and sisters, to lift up songs of worship to God, to serve one another. And giving God the first of our day or first of our evening, right? Having a life of prayer that puts God first before anything happens in our day. What's the first thing that we do? A life of prayer and a life of reading the scriptures. And to consider some practices of how we might put God first, both at the beginning of our day, but also at the beginning of our evening, before we go to bed. What are some ways we might be able to do that? And then giving God the first even of our meals. Cultivating a life of thanksgiving and gratitude. A simple way to do that. And some of you may have grown up where it's like it was kind of a legalistic thing. You got to pray before you eat. But to just come back to that, not with a legalistic mindset, but with one of gratitude. Say, God, you have provided everything good, and even this meal is something. And the people I get to share it with is a sign of your grace. Giving God the first of our giftings or strengths. How can we serve one another? How can we serve one another with intention? Even on Sundays, there's hundreds of people throughout the month that will jump in and serve in some different capacities as a part of the local church, and that's their form of worship. It's not just because the church needs someone to welcome people as they come, but many of them come with just this joy and this sense of blessing and purpose because they're not coming to church just to consume Christian goods and services, but to serve and to give and create space for people to encounter and experience God. And the last is just giving God the first of our income, the first of our increase. How do we honor God with our resources, with our finances, and consider what that life of worship might look like in that area as well? These habits, again, are not meant to act as some sort of Jesus-inspired New Testament religious law. That's not the heart of it at all. But these are just meant to be practical handles for how we might allow the grace of God that we've received through Jesus to be worked out into our everyday life. Dallas Willard said, how might we allow these gospel initiatives in our life to live the life of the kingdom of heaven into every corner of human existence? And that's the hope. As we learn to live a life of generosity, that we reflect back the goodness of God that we see in Jesus Christ, and that people could both hear our words and see our life and say, God is real, and see the story of Jesus lived out in our everyday lives.